In this video, we're going to talk about emergence theory by Irwin, which he presents as a fundamental theory which will unite quantum mechanics with special and general relativity through consciousness, through a understanding of reality, which brings all of these into a unity. And so it's a tall order, but I think there are a number of things which he gets very right, some of which I suspect aren't original, but there are also a couple respects where it falls short. So I just want to break it down. In particular, I want to break down his movie he put out around 6 years ago as part of his firm Quantum Gravity Research in Los Angeles called What is Reality? And essentially the theory is that so there are two things. There's a crystal is essentially a pattern that is periodic in any dimension, and quasi-crystal, this is just the basic background, is a projection of that periodic pattern into a lower dimension. So essentially the theory, emergence theory, is essentially that an 8-dimensional crystal projects a 4D quasi-crystal, which then gives rise to the 3D quasi-crystal that we inhabit, which is then the fundamental substructure of all reality, which is contained within this 8D geometric structure. And this is actually quite brilliant how he kind of brings this all together, because reality is then composed at Planck's length, which is supposedly the shortest unit of time. It's composed of tetrahedrons, with the side of each triangle being Planck's length, which is 10 to the negative 35 meters, which alternate between a few states, which then give rise to all the higher order coherence. But then the question is obviously what actually causes essentially the collapse if these tetrahedrons have the potential for several states, what actually causes the collapse. And there's also an intrinsic problem with this, which is a discrete display that there's actually a fundamental unit. It's not continuous. And the way that the CTMU solves the problem of this, of having a discrete display in the reality self-simulation, which is a term both Klee, Irwin, and Chris Langan use, is through generative hological processing, which allows for a true continuum while maintaining some elements of discreteness but I'm getting ahead of myself, but that if he gets to this point of what Chris Langan would call the extended superposition principle, that if one tetrahedron is in a certain space, it affects the states of all the other ones. So that's kind of the basis of causation. It's approaching this generative hological processing so then to determine the tetrahedron state, we have to introduce consciousness and conscious decision making, because essentially what this comes down to is a conscious transducer, which is selecting for information. So that you need that kind of decision making, that consciousness, in order to avoid randomness. And one of the main problems that the film points out with quantum mechanics and general relativity is that both assume a fixed speed of light without explaining why it is, and why it is that there are certain constants in the universe. And so you need to explain the speed of light, Planck's constant, and the fine structure constant, all these things which have this regularity, but there's no actual way to explain it in current theories in mainstream physics. And so you need a theory of everything to actually explain this, to bring this all together. And there are 7 clues which the film lays out. It's information, causality loops, non-determinism, consciousness, pixelation, the E8 crystal, and the golden ratio. And we'll cover a couple of those. So what it says is essentially that information is meaning in the form of symbolism, and another type of symbol is one that represents itself. So this comes back to what Chris Langan and the CTMU would call the USRE, the universe, is a self-representational entity. It's a symbol of itself. It's self-transducing information. So this is all very good. And reality is made up of information. And you actually can't really argue this, because people will say that the fundamental quantum is energy, and actually informational reductionism has become very in vogue in physics. But people will say that it's energy, because this is what Einstein basically proved, is that what appears to be matter is actually just energy requantizing itself. But energy has the potential for a particle to change position in order to actually bring that into a particular position. You need information, and energy is actually identified with information in the theory. But the problem with this is, to some degree, it comports with CTMU, but actually informational reductionism is just as problematic as material reductionism, as the materialism which permeates, science, which has permeated science for the last few centuries. Because there's this quote from I don't recall who, but it's some biologist, that we quite know what DNA is. It's a macromolecule which contains some sort of structure, but we also know what it achieves. It achieves quite apparently everything that it has baked into its structure this information. But in order for that information to be meaningful, it actually has to be read by a material transducer. So in the CTMU, the way that this is resolved is through telesis. It's a metaphysical generalization of energy and information as a self-dual quantity, which is then the currency of cognition, which combines matter and mind as a node in the universal kind of meta-cybernetic mind, that it's all part of the same mechanism and all. So, and then the next thing that they claim is that everything is essentially geometric, that it's all given rise to by this crystalline 8D structure. It's all geometric, and so Einstein shows how the past and the future simultaneously exist in one geometric object in this 4D space-time manifold that he constructed. But the problem with this in the CTMU is that saying reality is a fixed 4D manifold creates a completely deterministic and arbitrary model of the universe. What we need is actually a creative and generative model of the universe, a CGMU, so to speak. And Klee, Irwin, and the quantum gravity research and the emergence theory adding, just four additional dimensions, and saying that an 8D crystal is self-creating, it doesn't conceptually solve this error. It's like that meme about neural networks, is just add more layers. You're not actually resolving the fundamental structural problem of self-creation and creativity and generativity. And so without generative hological processing, without this continuous self-creating manifold which allows for true continuity by adjoining state and state transition events into a self-dual quantum, Irwin and emergence theory, you're forced to say that reality has they actually say this, that reality is essentially frames on a movie reel, but it's just 10 to the 44 frames per second, a Planck length of time. And a movie, it's a helpful analogy to describe states and state transition, but you can't actually have a discrete display, because what's happening in between those quantums, there's meaning to words. And so, but they bring up a really good point that after that, even though that goes somewhat awry, but it brings up a really good point that the future creates the past, which creates the future, and all of time is the creative and generative processing. All of time, which includes within it every state throughout all of time, is the creative and generative processing for state transition. So they have this great quote. It says, all of time is affecting all time all of the time. And so but this still falls short, where you have a geometric structure like Einstein, not a logico-geometric structure like the CTMU, because it leads to deterministic determinism, even though they deny that they actually say that there's a model for free will and non-determinism, which we'll get to. But it leads to determinism by not distinguishing between potential and actualization, whereby the former programs the latter and generates timelines in a process called telic recursion, which actually allows for the cool quote to make sense. And so they say reality is its own creator, and this is true, but it can't be justified by what it said so far. You can't just have an arbitrary and deterministic manifold and say it's non-deterministic and it created itself. That's not how models work. And so it claims non-determinism, but it doesn't separate itself enough from Einstein's geometric theory to meaningfully support that claim in its model. And so the next thing they bring up is this idea of consciousness, that particles don't actually exist until they're observed. In order to account for existence, you need to, and that's known by Heisenberg's and John Wheeler's in particular model of quantum physics, but that particles don't actually exist until they're observed. They exist kind of as a potential, as a wave function, it's called. And so, but in order to account for existence, you need to represent and identify the manifold with a conscious entity / observer capable of generating information. And this is called, in the CTMU, it's called the primary teller, which is identified with a conspansive manifold, which is actually an improvement in a lot of respects on Klee Irwin's 8D crystal, in which we and our consciousnesses are images of reality and can thus observe and participate in quantum events and creation at large. So I'm just not seeing that the observer participancy fully fleshed out in the emergence theory model. And the fact that, and Klee Irwin says towards the end of the video that a universal collective-like consciousness may be physically inevitable in terms of what our theory actually leads to. But he says, we don't have to anthropomorphize this idea or make it religious or spiritual. And the answer to that is, of course we do. To say God is a personal being with will and volition and private experience and a generalized form of emotion and consciousness appropriate to his godlike being, combined with creativity and generativity, as well as a number of, human, well, no, it's actually God's traits, but, human traits generalized, who then identifies with the conspansive manifold, with the creation and evolution of reality, is what it takes to model a self-authoring and self-evolving universe. You can't do it. Newton knew this. Leibniz knew this. These intellectual giants all knew that you need God to make a fundamental theory hang together. So without the kind of theistic approach, I think emergence theory will always fall short, even though it does kind of acknowledge this universal consciousness, which is kind of an impersonal force. It's just this crystal. And so overall, I'd say the video, and especially, was excellently made. I mean, it's just stunning and beautiful, and it's almost absurd how good the video is, and I'd highly recommend you watch it. But it's clear that the present formulation of emergence theories is asking all of the right questions, but it falls short in a number of important respects. And the problem is that it's asking all the right questions, but when they answer those questions, if they answer those correctly, they're going to end up essentially with a clone of the CTMU, and especially because they're talking, quantum gravity research was founded in 2004, so they're in a lot of cases talking about concepts that Chris Langan introduced decades before without giving him any credit. I believe Chris Langan actually had to force Klee Irwin to cite him for a paper he wrote called the reality self-simulation hypothesis or something, which is the same, which Chris Langan has been talking about for decades, and actually published a paper with almost that exact same title. And so it's clear that either Klee Irwin or other folks at quantum gravity research are either are pretty much overtly plagiarizing the CTMU in a lot of instances. And there's thus another issue with this is intellectual honesty, that they're not actually giving credit for where their ideas are coming from. You know, it's safe to say that your ideas are coming from John Wheeler or Werner Heisenberg or Albert Einstein. And actually in the video, it's kind of weird because they spend like several minutes basically, you know, whenever they have comedic relief, it's just relentlessly mocking Albert Einstein, just making him into this like joke-like character, which is, you know, it's like funny, but it's indicative of kind of the hubris of Klee Irwin and the project at large. So I think it falls short in a number of respects, and even though it's pretty good as a fundamental theory, it describes a lot of, you know, very accurate things. It's essentially going to end up being a CTMU clone if they get it right, and so I don't think that it's not. Klee Irwin, I think, is an intellectual lightweight relative to Langan, although I'd love to eventually interview him and actually talk to him and talk about his theory and its implications. But that's all. Let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.